Well, welcome. Welcome to those who are visiting Pepperdine from around the country. Welcome to those who are on campus. Welcome to those who are in the Zoom world. So we're glad that you're here. This is Pepperdine's President's Speaker Series. This began about 7 years ago when I took the baton. And we're honored to have you here with us today. Education is never neutral. That may sound like a strong statement, but it simply means that everyone educates from one perspective or another, whether they're willing to admit it or not. G.K. Chesterton once said, "Education is simply the soul of a society as it's passed from one generation to the next." And of course, we know that you cannot pass along a neutral soul. What we choose to teach, how we choose to teach it, how we measure what we've taught or what's been learned, these all reflect a vision of what we believe a human being is and what we believe a human being is for. During my recent sabbatical, from which I've just returned a little bit less than a week ago, I did a fair bit of reading, including some of the writings of Cicero, the Roman statesman, who once warned, "Not to know what happened before one was born is to always be a child." His insight reminds us that education is not merely about preparing students for the next exam or for the next job, but about situating them within a much longer human story, one that stretches backward through history and stretches forward into responsibility. This reminds me of a quote that I've often used from a professor from MIT, James Monroe, when he said, "The question to be asked at the end of each educational step is not what has the student learned, but instead, who has the student become?" A society that cuts itself off from its intellectual inheritance becomes shallow, reactive rather than reflective, efficient rather than wise. For centuries, education in the West was grounded in a belief that students should be formed by the very best of what's been thought, what's been written, and what's been discovered through great texts, through rigorous reading, reasoning, and sustained engagement with truth, goodness, and beauty. More importantly, it's been grounded in the deep Christian faith that gives us our North Star for truth, our understanding of human purpose, and our unwavering belief in the dignity of every person. That's why our undergraduate core curriculum here at Pepperdine is built on the foundation of the classic liberal arts, and why we have a thriving Great Books program that allows students to explore and be formed by the riches of the great conversation. In fact, we're currently in the final stages of planning the opening and launching of a new Great Books Honors College, scheduled, God willing, to open in the fall of 2027.
Here.
We do have some academic hurdles to get over, so I don't want those who are going to be making those decisions to think we are presuming them, but we are praying for them. Through careful reading, through thoughtful dialogue, and intellectual humility, our students learn how to think and how to situate themselves within a living tradition of history and inquiry. Above all, they are formed and mentored by our incredible professors of great character and courage. For many years, such an approach was a given in American higher education, and all the way back from kindergarten through higher education. Before students could become good workers, business people, teachers, doctors, even lawyers, we always knew that they must first become good citizens, men and women of virtue and wisdom. In recent years, however, debates over standards, testing, and outcomes, and a look around at the climate on a lot of campuses have raised important questions about whether our educational systems are still aligned with that formative vision, or whether, in the pursuit of efficiency, standardization, and things of that nature, something important, something essential has been lost. At Pepperdine, we believe education should be both rigorous and humane. We believe that intellectual excellence and moral formation are inseparable. We believe that students flourish when they are transformed by serious engagement with great ideas and the great works that have shaped civilization. That conviction is why today's conversation matters. Our guest this afternoon has spent the last decade asking a deceptively simple question. What if? What if the way we assess students actually reinforced the kind of education we say we value? What if testing rewarded deep reading, thoughtful reasoning, and sustained engagement with the intellectual tradition? He's not only asked that question, but he's done something about it. It's my pleasure to welcome a leader who has become a central voice in the national conversation about education, assessment, and the future of learning. Jeremy Wayne Tate is the founder and CEO of the Classic Learning Test, a college entrance exam grounded in the classical liberal arts tradition and built around engagement and great texts, and a national leader in the revival of classical education. Under his leadership, CLT has grown from an idea into a nationally recognized assessment accepted by hundreds of colleges and universities around the United States. The test has influenced curricular decisions at schools, shaped conversations about literacy and classical education, and offered students a pathway that rewards depth, clarity of thought, and serious reading. He's a frequent speaker on education reform and has written widely on the purpose of education in a democratic society. He's been featured on MS Now and Fox News, The Washington Post and The Wall Street Journal, Inside Higher Ed, and New York Times, to name a few. Prior to founding the Classic Learning Test, Tate served as the director of college counseling at Mount DeSales Academy in Catonsville, Maryland. He received his bachelor in secondary education from LSU and a master's degree in religious studies from the Reformed Theological Seminary. This afternoon, he will help us think more clearly and carefully about what we're aiming for, why true education matters, and what the next few decades of American education should look like. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Jeremy Tate.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's start pretty basic. Let's make sure that we define our terms. What is classic learning and what are classical schools?
Yeah, great question. If I could, though, just take a minute to just thank President Gash. It's wonderful to be back on campus at Pepperdine. I told my wife last night on the phone that if there's one individual I'm most inspired by in higher ed, it is this man right here. And I have to just embarrass you with this story of meeting you about a year ago at the art conference in London. This is the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, and we had been connected through the conference app through a mutual friend. And President Gash said, I'm in line here to go into this talk from your friend Jordan Peterson, who I think spoke here as well. And as we're chatting, he said, when these doors open, we're going to run to the table. And I thought, we're in suits, we're gentlemen, we've got, dress shoes on. And I thought we're going to walk briskly, and the doors open, and he's in a dead sprint. Like he played football at Abilene Christian. He can still run like a 4.5 and so I had a hard time keeping.
A 4.5
But just seeing your passion, for Pepperdine, your love for this university, it's incredible to be here. It's a tough job, so thank you for your leadership. It's a great question. What is classic learning? There's a lot of conversations right now about, especially in this AI moment, going back to first principles. What even is education? And I started off teaching in inner city New York in 2004. And my wife did Teach for America. I did Urban Teachers. We went to a school where I didn't meet a single student in 3 years that lived with two married parents, their biological parents, not one. And I was completely disillusioned with the whole project by the time I left. And I said, what are we even doing? What are we trying to do? These kids are living in a world that is a spiritual wasteland in many ways. They had a deep spiritual need that nobody was addressing. I thought the problem here isn't that they immediately need to learn about the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. There's a spiritual problem here that is in no way being addressed. We started to question, what even is education? What are we trying to do? And then began to understand this tension between this ancient telos, education as the cultivation of virtue, education as the passing along of a cultural and intellectual inheritance, and then seeing that vision for education that had always been education for centuries, for millennia, had really been displaced in the 20th century with education that was more about jobs training instead. But I think now we're in the midst of an incredible recovery movement of not just recovering great curriculum, great ideas, great books, but fundamentally recovering the telos or the aim of education itself, which for Christians I think is very close to what we would call Christian sanctification. Growing in holiness, growing in wisdom, growing in a love for Christ. And that, when I talk, we've got a lot of great leaders in this room. We've got Tim Weems, who's one of the giants of Christian schooling in this country. Well, what does success look like in a Christian school? It should be very different from our public school counterparts, And the marker should be things like faithfully going to church, giving to your community, right? Participating in civic life, faithful marriages. I think these are the markers. But I think we're in a real moment of recovery. It's exciting to be a part of that.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. And give us a little bit of a definition of the classics. What are the classics, and what's a classical school as compared to other schools?
What are the classics? There we go. Okay. All right. Hello. A little bit nervous to answer that question with Dr. Jessica Hooten-Wilson in the room, one of the giants of the great books here. What are the classics? At CLT, we kind of came up with our own definition of something, to be on our author bank, you got to be dead for at least 50 years. Because it takes a while for different generations to kind of sort through if something really is timeless, if it can really speak to people in different places, in different generations, in different contexts, and different places and cultures around the world. And it's those texts that have this ability, which I think is just so, in some ways, just magical and amazing, to speak so deeply into what it means to be human that they become timeless. They can transcend time. It was amazing. I didn't grow up getting anything like a classical education. I went to public school. My mom was a public school teacher. And when I started to discover this movement, I started changing the books I was reading with my kids. I started bringing home books like Aesop's Fables. Children, 3-year-olds, are the very best literary critics. They want the old stuff. They want the timeless. They were done with the new stuff as soon as I had Aesop's Fables. That's the good stuff. That's what they want. And that's what I think we're recovering right now. These kinds of texts that have stood the test of time. And kids know this. High school kids know this. I taught in public schools for 10 years. And sometimes they know that this book they're getting that was, published 2 years ago, nobody's going to read it in 10 years. It's going to be completely forgotten about. And when you pull out something and say, hey, for 2,000 years, this story, the Odyssey, right, this has been passed down for 2,000 years, and now we're passing it down to you. That is something sacred and powerful.
So the classics are, just to make sure I understand, stories, books that have withstood the test of time and have demonstrated their ability to shape and form students of virtue and character through their storytelling. Is that?
I think that's right. Hooten-Wilson, how do we do?
Okay.
All right.
So you become, and I'll just say me too. I did not grow up reading the classics. My parents were both public school teachers, and I read what I was told I had to read to be prepared for the exam, and oftentimes I read something that was quite a bit shorter and had a yellow cover on it. That was my Uncle Cliff wrote it. But it was not. I was not engaged. I was not pulled into the learning process. We had a similar experience. At some point, part of it sounds like your teaching in New York had something to do with it. But there was a point at which you decided, something's got to be done about this, and I think it's got to be me. What was that moment that you said, okay, there are 2 national college entrance exams, the SAT and the ACT. There should be a third, and I should start it. Tell us how that
That's right. First, a couple disclaimers. I was a very normal child, wanted to play in the NFL, like wanted to do normal kid things. Never was like, I'm going to start a test when I grow up. Was not at all the plan. And but 2015, I was at a school. I for years I wanted to get into a Christian school after kind of giving up personally on just the public school experience. Again, even as a public school student myself, and I wanted to get there. And when I got there, when I got to a Catholic school run by these Nashville Dominican nuns. We'd call them the Dancing Dominicans. Very young order, very vibrant, and super, just huge love for Christ. It was a wonderful school, but when I got there, I was really shocked by the influence of the college board. And I should tell you one of the first ways that this showed up. So one of these sisters, Sister Mary Bridget, she wanted to introduce 2 new classes. One was in Christian apologetics and one was in philosophy. And as a recent seminary graduate, I was part of talking to her about the texts and the authors and the sequence and all of this. And we were both so excited about it. And then registration time came in March or April, and hardly any students at all signed up for either the Christian apologetics or the philosophy course. And I was also the college counselor. And so I was talking to the students like philosophy, like these are the great questions. What is happiness? What is a good life? And the number one thing students said, this was a high-performing school, was, Mr. Tate, it's not any AP points. And I was baffled. And I was like, what does it matter? And they said, even if I get an A, it's going to hurt my GPA. And so it was the beginning of the process for me of thinking through the influence of the College Board. I was already running an SAT prep company, and I was already frustrated there for both what they didn't put on the SAT and what they did put on the SAT. I was like, what an opportunity. You've got millions, like every high school kid basically in the country, reading what you want them to read. Put them in front of something beautiful and timeless, right? That would be good. I mean, think about all the time spent in prep, right? And I think as well, one of the very few ideas in education that almost everybody agrees on, for better or worse, is that the test inevitably ends up driving and shaping the curriculum. And so 2015, SAT and ACT had to move to align with the Common Core standards. And I actually thought I had an idea. It wasn't the CLT idea. Everybody I knew was frustrated. They say, hey, the only 2 college entrance exams are Common Core aligned. Where's our test? So I thought I had a business idea of, well, I'm going to make a prep course for the new test because somebody who makes test is making the new test. And so I'm started researching frantically up in the middle of the night, who's making the new test? Because everybody wants a new test. And I realized that nobody's doing it. And then I thought, wow, everybody wants this. And it was like, I'm in a weird position. I know a ton of people in admissions because I'm a college counselor. And then I thought, well, how hard could it be? It turned out it was really hard. And my wife will say, I always assume everything is very easy. How hard can it be to have 6 kids in 6 schools, which we do right now? It's like, but yeah, it was, where would you start? And we say, well, you would need a blueprint, a first test to submit to colleges. And then once you have one college accept, then we could tell students about this. And so for the past 10 years, we've kind of gone back and forth between students, homeschoolers, Christian schools, and then colleges and universities. First test we ever had in June of 2016, we had a grand total nationwide of 46 students take it. This year, well over 500,000 nationwide. So it's been, I always say, I feel like CLT is something that happened to me rather than something I did. I feel like kind of caught up in this story that I never could have written.
So just to make sure I'm tracking, the idea of teaching to the test, something I grew up in, and my parents were both school teachers. My wife was a school teacher. That, the California test, there's these standards you can be tested on. And so every day in class, we're being taught the things that we're going to be tested on so that our school can show the state that we're really good at this. And all we're really good at, shouldn't say all we're really good at, certainly we're good at what they put on the test. So your idea is like, if that's going to be the case, let's make a test that causes them to say, okay, we're going to teach them this. And teaching the this is what you're looking for. What is the this that you want them to teach?
That's exactly right. We'd have this conversation at the school that I was at of how do we keep our teachers, we'd have this as an administrative team, how do we keep our teachers from teaching towards the test, from teaching towards the SAT and the ACT and the AP and having that. And so at some point the question got in my head somehow of, well, what if we stopped trying to change that? And instead the thing we tried to change was the test itself. Because it seemed in some ways like an impossible dynamic to change, that teachers want to do well. And how does a teacher do well? Their students do great on the test. right? But if the test is the kind of test that excludes everything the teacher thinks is most important, that actually sends a powerful message to the students that the students don't miss, right? When you bring in an external authority into a school that's not at all on board with the academic vision for the school, it powerfully undermines that, even to students. They get it. They often view the College Board as ACT as an external authority that in some ways, speaks above the school, if that answers your question.
Yeah, so how did you determine what was going to be on the test? And I assume, well, I know this is the case, but I'll just pretend I don't know. Tell us a little bit about, are there different levels of tests for different levels of the people in education? And like, give us an example of what is on a test such that we know what you're encouraging the teachers to teach.
Yeah, that's great. So short answer is we kind of cheated. We looked at places like Thomas Aquinas College. We looked at places like St. John's College in Annapolis. We said, you've been doing this for a long time. And we looked at so a place like St. John's or Thomas Aquinas, there's no major. It's just kind of an immersion into the Western intellectual tradition. So we looked really closely at their reading list, and that's how we came up with our first, what we would call, author bank. So the CLT has an author bank. Dr. Jessica Hinton-Wilson's been a big part of this over the years. And so 2/3 of everything on the CLT is from the author bank. And actually, there's some great, heavy debates about who should be on that and who shouldn't be on that. Some people, Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, Augustine, John Calvin, a lot of those were easy. But then there's a lot of people kind of right on the periphery. And if we want to keep it small and manageable enough, we want people to be in continuity with this great tradition, that we feel like until very recently always defined a serious education.
And so how do you respond to the inevitable criticism that if you have to be dead for at least 50 years, and if the education system favors, at least a long time ago, this idea of men and old white men, how do you respond to the criticism of what you're going to get is only dead old white men? Is that the case? If not, how not? How do you respond to something like that?
Yeah, it's such a great question. So we've actually had for 4 years, I believe you met Dr. Angel Adams-Parham, who's a professor at the University of Virginia. She's the author of the Black Intellectual Tradition as well, and she actually shepherded the author bank revision at CLT, wanting to do a couple things, wanting to make sure that we were balanced between ancients and moderns, then also wanting to make sure that we were including as many diverse voices as possible. But at the same time, recognizing just what you said, that 500 years ago, it simply was the case that there just were a limited number. Catherine of Siena, you have some, but for the most part, the people really getting publishing tended to be men. I believe that when we look at the canon is something that is always evolving. I think 500 years from now, it'll look different. And we have made a few exceptions. Toni Morrison is on the CLT author bank, Maya Angelou, for authors that did not technically meet the dead for 50 years rule, but just given cultural influence right now, I think we could make a pretty safe bet that they're going to become part of the canon and therefore worthy of passing down as well.
So what is your, how many SKUs do you have, so to speak? How many different tests do you provide, and at what levels of education?
Yeah, so we started off with just an alternative to the SAT and ACT. This is 2015, 2016, and then eventually, what we're seeing this as kind of a proxy war, right? And so really what we're viewing is trying to create an alternative to the College Board. I believe is by far the #1 most influential organization in American education. Right? They control all of the AP curriculum, the AP testing. And so what we really want to do, I see, testing as a proxy war, not just for testing, but for a vision for education. And the College Board has been pushing education as college and career readiness for decades. We're saying, actually, that's a very impoverished vision for education. Education is merely jobs training. So we started off with just an alternative to the SAT, then we launched an alternative to the PSAT, and then we have gone down all the way to 3rd grade. So we have 3rd through 8th grade assessments as well. And every test has to be a new test as well. And, I always put it this way, a test is probably never going to change, or not often, a single student's life, right? I mean, if a student came and say, their life totally changed, they said, it's from this test. You're like, really? That happened? But a school changes a student's life, right? And the test has a big influence on a school being able to be faithful to its mission and vision. And so what we're trying to do is in some ways build some of the kind of the crucial infrastructure. And I think about it this way as believers. I mean, Christianity, we created the first universities. We created the first schools, right? In many ways, Christianity was the educational establishment until the 20th century. And over the past 100 years, we've kind of lost that high ground. And I think in that, I think higher ed's become a bit of a mess. It's become this kind of lost telos, right? It's not good for students to process that their education is just about, I mean, I would ask this as a public school teacher, and I was asking them because I didn't know. I was trying to figure it out. Like, why are you here? What are you doing in this room? What's the point of school? I'm not kidding. 90% of the time, they'd say, to get a better job. And they'd kind of say it like, we know, Mr. Tate, to get a better job. It's such an impoverished vision for why we educate, right? I think you go into a lot of these great schools now. See, why are we here? To grow in wisdom, to grow in love for Christ, right? To grow in my capacity to love. So I think it really is that testing can be kind of a battleground for these competing visions for education.
And we've seen a rise in the number of families who are sending their kids to private schools, private Christian schools, private classical schools. Do you have a sense, can you articulate a little bit how quickly that's rising, maybe from what to what, or give us a general sense of the trajectory of education in K through 12 moving away from the standard public school context?
Yeah, I would say, I'd put rock bottom in the 1970s. The 70s in some ways were rock bottom for a few things. Architecture, kitchen.
My wife was born in the 70s, so careful.
Okay, hey, that's right. Jolene was the one great thing that came out of the 70s, for sure. But really, I mean, in terms of, it was a low point for Christian education in the country. It's the first time we have the census to look at homeschooling, and there was at that point about 13,000 homeschoolers in the country. I mean, homeschooling was very normal in colonial America, but I think, 13,000 homeschoolers in the early 70s. Right now, it's 5 million-ish, an absolute explosion, right? The number of new schools that are being launched. I mean, we have these different arenas this is happening. We have a ton of new schools starting, a lot of new classical Christian schools starting. You have a lot of established schools, a lot of like Catholic schools that are kind of revisiting why they're doing what they're doing. And I think a lot of them, started to parrot unintentionally. It happened slowly over time. They wanted great standards. But they started to parrot a lot of the public school arena. And I think right now, in COVID, I mean, this is when this kind of came to a tipping point. I think a lot of parents, suddenly the classroom was in their kitchen, and the parents are like, what are you learning? What is this? And even that gap between their own education and their kids, things really changed, And I think a lot of parents have had this sense of, I went to school there, it's fine, When in reality, they went to that building. But what's happening in that building is really different right now. So we're seeing for the first time in history, New York City public schools, we're seeing a contraction in some of the biggest districts, and a lot of these students are going to more traditional options, homeschool, Christian school. And we saw the first growth in Catholic schooling in 60 years. We saw that in 2022. So I think things we're in a recovery moment right now, and I think it is so important that higher ed, when you think about how, I'm convinced that there is nothing more culturally influential as our elite universities, right? I mean, the K-12s follow higher ed, and all of the rest of culture is downstream from education, right? And so when Princeton, Harvard, Yale, when those are doctrinally sound Christian seminaries, basically, had a huge influence on American culture. And we've lost that for well over 100 years, and there is a desperate need right now for institutions, universities, that are both academically the very, very best and Christian Orthodox. And I think Notre Dame is flirting with that on the Catholic side. I think Pepperdine is the clear solution on the Protestant side, and it is so needed, I think.
Well, thank you. We agree with you on that. Let me ask you a provocative question. I'm not saying I agree with Notre Dame flirting with it. I'm saying Pepperdine is the solution on the project. Just to be clear for the record. Provocative question. At least it seems provocative to me. It probably won't be to you because you've thought about this more than I have. You talked about the Harvards and the Yales and the Princetons, and we saw some of the Columbia, and we've seen NYU, and we've seen some professors, some presidents at Harvard and Penn and MIT in front of the bright lights, much brighter lights than here, of Congress, talking about what it is they're doing on their campuses. And so there's this criticism that is kind of a cliche or a catchy thing. I've even used it several times myself to say, at our school, we don't teach our students what to think, we teach them how to think. And it's usually a pretty good applause line because you do want to teach your students how to think. But as I've reflected on that more, even as I hear myself say it, it's like, okay, that's clever and it's good and we don't want to teach them how to think, but isn't there something that we do want to teach them what to think? And how do we determine what that is? And so in K through 12 and in university, how would you react to, actually, we do want to teach them what to think. We don't want to indoctrinate them to say this is the only way to think, but we think, here are the presuppositions. So, for example, free speech is a good thing. Protection of faith is a good thing. You were made by a creator God who loves you. Self-governance is a good thing. Wrestle with that. Tell me, am I the only one who thinks that we've gone a little bit too far by disassociating ourselves with a viewpoint? Because to combat what was perceived to be viewpoint orthodoxy, to say that we should have no viewpoint and we should be completely neutral. I want to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's a phrase that has become very popular. Of course, we're not indoctrinating here. We just teach them, we don't teach them what to think. We just teach them how to think well. And then everybody's disarmed. We're like, oh, good, okay. But in reality, it is hollow. Josh Gibbs, I think he's one of the leaders of kind of one of the thought leaders in the classical Christian movement that I love. He's talked a lot about this. And really, I think anyone in Christian education, if we think about this for a minute, we disagree. And we disagree because we want to teach them to love what God loves and to hate what God hates. We know what God loves. God loves holiness. God loves, the virtues we're called to live as Christians, right? With self-control and temperance, right? And fidelity. God loves those things. So that is teaching students what to think, right? And cultivating their convictions that is true.
And so at the same time, is it fair to say that we also want them to understand and to be able to critique and wrestle with things that we don't want them to think, but they're going to hear in the real world those viewpoints and prepare them to have a defense for what they believe? Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, and some of the ways I think about this is kind of mental furniture. There's a really interesting study on reading acquisition and comprehension years ago. And what they did is they proved that students who had a deep knowledge of baseball, but a significantly lower reading level than students who had very little knowledge of baseball, but a much higher level of reading, the lower the students performed better in retention because they knew the rules of the game, they knew the context, right? And so when we talk about bringing students into a literary tradition or the Western intellectual tradition, it is giving them some of that kind of mental furniture, and that's what we say. We get this question a lot about on the CLT, like, do you have to have a classical education? Well, no, you're going to see passages from people like C.S. Lewis on the CLT. But, let's say, you see on the CLT a passage from Dante, or Boethius, right? There's going to be more familiarity with that kind of text. If you've read those kinds of, there's going to be a comfort level. There's going to be some of the mental furniture there, I think.
Thank you for that. Let's get a little bit personal. And you mentioned Dante, you mentioned some other texts. What was your entry point into having not grown up in the classics? How did you say, okay, I'm going to jump in here, like, where do I start? And so where did you start? How did it proceed? And what are some of the book or two that you feel like, wow, that one was something I should give to anybody I care about?
Yeah, I love this. And it's kind of an embarrassing story, honestly. So I didn't do well in high school. I actually hated school. My mom was a teacher. My parents' rule was that I had to have a 2.75 to not be grounded. If I had below that, I was basically on house arrest. And so that was my motivation to do well in school. And I didn't care until I became a believer. So my senior year in high school, I gave my life to Christ. I went to a young life camp. I heard the gospel. And then something else happened. Somebody gave me a copy of Mere Christianity, my area director. And I came home and I'm reading nonstop. My parents are like, "What is wrong with our child? He's never opened a book." And in college, I was kind of a hermit. I was just devouring. It started with Christian apologetics. But I met a girl as well at this Young Life camp. And we actually, over theological disagreements, broke up at the end of our sophomore year in college. She dumped me, is actually what happened. And so I did what any reasonable 20-year-old would do. I drove to Alaska to sulk and for the summer and feel bad for myself. But on the way to Alaska, I was thinking, what could I do to get the girl back? Because my plan was to marry her, and she'd really messed that up by dumping me. I'm like, what can I do to get her back? Well, she had taken a class at the University of Virginia. She was the smart one class president. It's kind of our joke that I got to start the standardized test. But I was thinking, what can I do to win her back? Well, she had taken this class at UVA that was called, I think it was like Redemptive Themes in Russian Literature. And she was super impacted by it. And at that point in my life, I didn't even get why you would read fiction. I was like, it didn't even happen. Like, why would you do that? I liked history, I liked Christian apologetics, I even liked philosophy, but like novels, fiction, like just making up stories, that cannot be a worthwhile time. So she was really, really impacted by Crime and Punishment. And so I have the idea, I'm like, if I can get this book and read it and talk to her about it, like, we're going to get married again. And so I go to the Soldotna Public Library in Soldotna, Alaska, and I find this book. I get it, and this is this weird chapter in my life where I've got a whole summer, I've got zero distractions. I've got no TV, no radio, no smartphone. I can twiddle my thumbs or I can read this book to try to get the girl back. And I thought I would just read it to be able to talk to her. And it completely changed my life. I was completely gripped, and if you haven't already read Crime and Punishment, spoiler alert, I mean, it's a 160-year-old book, so you might not read it, but it's kind of the first, psychological thriller in a way. It starts off with this horrible, double murder, and then you see throughout the story the way that sin disfigures his heart and his soul and his mind and his relationships, and in many ways it gives you a healthy fear of sin. And so to me, that was the beginning. I went from Crime and Punishment to Brothers K and Tolstoy and War and Peace and just started kind of devouring. I didn't really know what it was. I kind of knew these were the books that you ought to read and books that were famous. And I thought, I'm not getting this at LSU. And so just started kind of picking this up on my own, I think far before I was aware there was this kind of revival happening or anything.
So Crime and Punishment would be a critical one.
Yeah, for me it was, for sure. And Brothers Karamazov as well.
We all have to know. Did you get the girl?
So, good ending. Yeah, we did get married. We've got 6 kids. It's going.
All right.
The plan worked. The plan worked,
So Dr. Contino there in the back, who was my daughter's teacher for Brothers Karamazov, she then required me to read it. So Crime and Punishment will get you a spouse. Is that what we just heard? Okay. Brothers K. So let's get back to the meta story of you deciding you're going to take down SAT, ACT, or at least get in their realm. What was the reaction? Like, did they just kind of brush you off, or have there been conversations? And what do you see the future of the CLT relative to the SAT and ACT? Are you gaining? What's your long-term vision?
Yeah, in some ways looking back, I never would have, again, I thought, how hard could this be? I'm glad we did it, glad I did it. Wouldn't have, probably, maybe, I don't know, if do it again, knowing what was ahead. I mean, the road ahead was way harder than I ever possibly imagined. I mean, the first couple years, I remember the first conference I went to, I was so excited to tell people. And at one point, literally, a group of people were cracking up laughing, saying, starting an alternative to the SAT and ACT. And it was like just me. I was the only employee, and so it was really slow. Like we had, I mean, there was a million different fronts to it. People thought but it was kind of, one hard fought win after another in terms of getting smaller colleges to say, sure, we'll accept the CLT. We've looked at this in admission standard. A big break came in 2017. Hillsdale put a lot of time into vetting CLT and interviewing all of our schools and looking at our process and everything. And when a lot of colleges knew they were doing this, and when they adopted, it was when we first started getting kind of inbound colleges coming and saying, hey, we want to be part of CLT as well and accept this as an alternative. And then with each college adoption, more and more students have been utilizing it. And then really for us in 2023, it was where things just went really silly. And so 2023, 2024, and we had spent years trying to cultivate like a brand that was nice and friendly and all of this, and maybe sophisticated, conservative. We always said we actually went through this brand thing as a company, and they're like, this is 2019. They're like, all right, if CLT was an animal, what animal would it be? We're like, I don't know. Finally, I said, if CLT was a person, it'd be Robbie George. That's what I said. And so, but then in 2023, as part of Ron DeSantis' bid for the White House, he got in this public feud with the College Board. He said, I'm going to kick you out of the state of Florida and bring somebody better in. And we're like, okay, what's going on here? And we're the only person who does this. And so, next thing we know, we're in conversation with his team, and they make us an equal to the SAT and ACT in Florida. And so suddenly you can get a full ride to Florida State, the University of Florida, with a CLT score of a 96. So we went from 25,000 test takers nationwide in 2023 to 250,000 in 2024. We had people sleeping at the office. I mean, it was wild. And then since then, a bunch of states in terms of the either Board of Governor or Regents or state legislature, just recently, Indiana, we got Indiana University, Purdue, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, Ohio State now as well, and then this past fall as well, West Point, the Naval Academy, the Air Force Academy. So it's been pretty wild. I mean, for a lot of people, it's like, oh, this just started. I was like, no, there was just 7 years of just trying. I always describe it as like trying to start a fire in the rain with wet wood and wet matches, and you're just getting dumped on for like 7 years, and it's just, but like now there's finally life to it, and that's a lot of fun.
So what you're saying is Hillsdale gave you the first boost from, to 25,000, and then when Pepperdine came in a couple of years ago, then it took.
That's right.
Everybody wanted to be. So if you're wondering, yes, Pepperdine accepts the CLT along with the SAT and ACT. So you didn't set out to become a convener, at least as I understand it. It was I want to solve a problem. The problem is the education that's happening. How do you get the education to be what it should be? Well, you create a test. You've also ended up becoming a convener, not just of people interested in the testing, but of schools. We have with us several folks. In fact, if you are an administrator or a teacher at a K through 12 school, can you stand so we can just thank you? We also have one of the leaders in classical education as well. You want to introduce Tim Weens?
Tim Weens, stand up as well. Tim Weens is the founder of CISA, the Council for Educational Standards and Accountability, and one of the leaders of the Christian school for the past few decades. So, and is now a member of the CLT team as well, leading our Christian school partnerships.
So you set off to create a test to influence education, and now you've become a convener, and in fact, in many ways, an influencer on the creation of classical schools, Christian schools. Tell us a little bit about how that evolved.
Yeah, I think it was trying to kind of lock arms. Our goal was not in any way to be a convener. Our goal was to pick a fight with the College Board. I don't know if anybody's a Braveheart fan, but my favorite part of any movie is like before the Battle of Stirling and William Wallace is getting ready to ride off. They're like, where are you going? He's like, to pick a fight, I'm like, yes, yes, So like we exist to pick a fight with the College Board. And in doing that, we're like, we need a lot of great people who are like-minded. And so it was a matter of trying to say, hey, and you think about all of these schools, we would go and we would ask the students and the teachers and the administrators, like, hey, do you like the College Board? No, nobody does, right? And then you ask the colleges, like, no, we don't like it either. Like, okay, nobody along this journey is on board, but everybody uses it. Like, this should be prime for disruption, for an alternative that's missionally aligned. And so I think in this process, it's been able, and this has happened in God's providence, pre-internet, without any intentional humans convening this. really the beginning of this renewal movement in education, this recovery of, again, this ancient telos, these foundations. I think CLT has come along and has started to provide some of that kind of critical infrastructure for the movement to scale. And it's a question we ask, for Christian schools, Catholic schools, like, all right, as long as you're deferring to the college board, secular progressive authority that isn't on board with your mission, right? What is the influence there? What is the impact there? And we believe that it's often a lot greater, sometimes than school leaders think.
So as you look forward into the future, and I so admire that you thought already to answer this question and to put something on your wall that answers the question. But to use a term that Brene Brown uses, paint done for me. When do you say we've accomplished what we set out to do? What do you need to do in order to get there?
Yeah, I love that question. So when people come on to CLT, there's a book. It's surprising to a lot of people that everybody has to read. It's a new book. It's actually Phil Knight's memoir of founding Nike, Shoe Dog. And so, Phil Knight, early 1960s, he's selling sneakers out of the back of his Plymouth at high school track meets. And he's saying, we're going to create something better than Reebok and better than Adidas. And people are like, no, you're not, 2004, Nike buys Reebok, right? 40 years later, they had a vision to elevate sports in a way that was just, really, really inspiring. So we got in our office a plaque that we got engraved and it says, it's a brief history of a standardized test. It looks like, and you read closely, and then it says in 2040, CLT surpassed the SAT and ACT as the #1 college entrance exam globally. And it's engraved, so we can't change it. So so when we come to work in the morning, it's kind of like our Notre Dame play like a champ plaque. We give it a little pound, and the goal is to make it come true, And again, the reason we want to do that is because we believe it's about influence. It's about redefining, thinking in 2040. We don't want students to answer, "What are you doing here?" with "I'm here to get a better job," right? We want them to say, "I'm here to grow in wisdom. I'm here to grow in holiness," right? "I'm here to grow in my capacity for love." So we think that testing is this main kind of proxy war for these competing visions for education. And yeah, for us to be #1 is a test that's more utilized in both the SAT and ACT. And we're actually a little bit ahead of schedule for where we thought we would be to get there for that 2040 goal.
Fantastic. Well, let's talk about what the impact of current changes in technology are doing, if anything, to what your premise is. So my entry, thanks to Kobe Doloff, was like, read the Odyssey. Like, okay, what's the first thing? So I read the Odyssey in the way I read. I put it in earbuds and listen to it. And I also can go online and type in, give me a summary of the Odyssey and all the things I need to pull from the Odyssey and read that in 15 minutes. What will AI do to classical education? Is there a bright spot of this, or is it going to make it harder for people to convince kids that they need to engage with the text as opposed to a summary of the text?
Yeah, such a great question. Again, just reflecting on my own experience, and I think Christians ought to have some kind of a healthy fear of sin, and thinking of the experience that Reading Crime and Punishment had on me, and that couldn't have happened through Cliff Notes. It happens through really, really getting in, turning page after page of a 800-page book where you're really deeply immersed in it. That's when formation happens, I think, And I think that I'm actually very optimistic that AI is kind of going to push education back towards first principles. Because if the question is just downloading information, then we're kind of doomed, But if the good teacher is the teacher that inspires virtue, inspires a life, inspires the right kind of passions, where students see that and they're like, I want to be like that teacher. I think so. I'm optimistic that it's going to have that kind of an influence on education. And I think right now the schools that are least impacted. Think about a place like St. John's College in Annapolis, or a place like Thomas Aquinas College. I walked past one of your seminars this morning. Same thing's happening here. There's not going to be an impact there. And what do employers really want? I mean, students know this. I was talking to a student just a few months ago, a teenager, and he's just diehard wanting to go to the service academies. I'm like, well, why? Tell me about that. He said, well, AI is going to take all the jobs. Nobody knows what the jobs are going to be. And so he'd been operating from the point of college is to get a job. Now we have no idea what the jobs are going to be, and so I should go to a service academy where I'm at least going to have 8 years of employment after that. Thoughtful kid, right? But I think what we do know is the kind of people that any company is going to want to work with, right? And the kind of people are, people that are getting the kind of formation they're getting at a place like Pepperdine. They're getting with teachers like Dr. Jessica Hinton-Wilson. That's not going to go away. Students that are virtuous, students that do right by their employer, students that don't lie. We hire heavily out of places like Patrick Henry College, places like TAC, UD, where in many ways they have the least practical education imaginable. It's very, right? And they're studying the great books, and they're sitting in circles and seminars and discussing. You're like, what skills are they getting? Well, they're not getting a skill. They're becoming a kind of person that you really want on your team. And I do think AI is creating again kind of a market force. It's going to push students in that direction, and it sounds like you're seeing that at Pepperdine. As I'm understanding, more students than you even imagined possible signing up for the Great Books core, and so we're seeing a real shift, and students desire this. Again, like they want. I mean, I think I had this experience of looking back at my own undergraduate education, even at LSU, and thinking of like all the books like I should have read, and I didn't learn that till much later, right? And so. Yeah, I think students more and more know this is out there. This is interesting. The most powerful marketing image, I think, in maybe the history of college marketing was just a picture from St. John's College in Annapolis of just a stack of the books they read. So colleges that do all this kind of cool stuff to attract students, they just took a picture of their reading list, and it went viral. Students desire this. They desire the timeless. And I think the institutions that are going to be offering this, especially in a formative kind of way, I think are going to be the institutions that do really well in the future. And this is just one more thing with this. I mean, you think about what is college and what is the value prop of college? And for centuries, it was really obvious. Like they owned the books. Like they actually owned the libraries. They owned access to information. They owned access to knowledge. Well, that changed in the digital revolution of the 90s. I mean, it's been 30 years since that changed. And so now there's a few value props left. If you're Harvard or something, you have club membership, and that's a value prop. But the big one is formation, right? The university isn't offering the books. You got the books on your iPhone. The university is offering the kind of formation that you can't give yourself.
Amen. One observation, then I'm going to kind of close with my last question, then I'll go to some of the questions that have been sent in. One observation is that, I grew up going to public school. My parents were public school teachers, and as I said, I kind of studied for the test and only at the last minute and didn't engage in class. And then we watched our kids go to Oaks Christian. We have some Oaks Christian folks here, and just saw the difference in their education and the education we had. We was like, we can't send our kids to Oaks. There's no way we could afford it. Then we visited. It's like, there's no way we can afford not to. There's things that are more important than the other things we'd be spending our money on. And then we went to, just this last fall, we went to Trinity Meadows in Arlington. And Jolene got to sit on some classes, and I got to sit on some classes and have some opportunity to talk to the students. And just watched them talk about the Odyssey. These like ninth graders, and I just got tears in my eyes and said, this is what it could have been. Like high school could have been like this. It's an incredible difference on what, I'm not saying there's no public schools that do it well, but to see what we got to see but not experience ourselves made it so clear to us that we want our grandkids. We told our kids, you're not going to get an inheritance when you die. What you're going to get is you're going to get a fund from which you can draw for your kids' education. And it's only going to be the kind of education that we approve. If you want to send them to public school, great. You want to send them to certain private schools, great. You're not getting our money because it matters that much. So here's the last question. Students who go through K through 12 at the schools you're talking about, Give us an insight, now that you've had such a great window into who they are, who the teachers are, what they're teaching. What are they looking for in a college education, a university education? The kids that come from those schools, what is center of their bullseye on their wish list for college?
Yeah, 2019 we actually didn't finish it, and partly because of what we were discovering. We were doing a retention study of CLT students. A lot of colleges were saying, we want to know how your students do with retention. And actually, a much larger number of students that we ever anticipated had transferred out. And as we talked to them, the main answer was that it felt remedial. And this was especially true of the students that had gone to public universities. And so, you're coming from a great school like the Oaks or the Woodlands, and you go sometimes to this, and again, I don't want to bash public school students. Again, I went to public school, but there's a real difference. And so I think increasingly, and this is why I'm so excited about the Honors College that you're launching here, they want to go to a place that's going to be a much deeper immersion into, I think, the tradition, the kind of education they got a taste of in high school. And I think more and more students need to know that. I mean, there's some good things, I think, happening in our public universities. In fact, a lot of them are launching new centers or kind of colleges within a college for civics and classical education in particular. And it's those students coming out of these great schools that are often kind of going to those destinations as well. So I think they're looking for that. And this other thing is happening. We've seen this with CLT for years. Professors are coming back to admissions, and they're often saying, where did these 5 students, because there is a really, really powerful contrast often between some of these students coming into these classrooms with some of the other ones. They're saying, I want more students who are coming out of the Oaks or the Woodlands or Regents of Austin or some of these great schools. And so, yeah, I think the secret is out, for sure. We're in the beginning phase still of this kind of incredible revival. And I think in many ways higher ed is now responding to that more than ever. I think it's so great what you're doing here with the Honors College and bringing one of the best people in this movement into it with Dr. Jessica Hooten-Wilson.
Excellent. And so how would you assess the level of interest that students graduating from a classical school and how they would fit at Pepperdine?
Yeah, I think extremely high. Again, there's just such a need, I think, for a place that's truly academically elite, and at the same time, students have always felt like they have to trade one or the other. They can go to the Top Gun destination in terms of academic excellence and try to go to one of the Ivies, or they can go to a place that's Orthodox Christian. But you can't pick both, because both isn't a thing. Well, it needs to become a thing again. It always was, and so I think it's bigger than Malibu. I think that believers around the world, there's a real need that we have as a Christian church for an institution that is uncompromising in terms of Christian fidelity, and then also the very, very best academically. And so I think, yeah, again, very grateful for your leadership in taking Pepperdine more and more in that direction.
Thank you. Let me turn to a couple questions. Well, several questions here. I want to combine a couple. One of them has to do with what is. I know some people got to go teach at a 1 o'clock class, and so we're going to go about another 15 minutes or so. But if you need to go ahead and go. I'm going to combine a couple questions. One of them had to do with what role does STEM play in CLT and in the test and in classical education, and then combining that with a question that says, when we are teaching to love what God loves, how are they different from a church? How is this different from a church? And how does that help us, say, conduct rigorous science and learn more about cancer? So what's the role of science in classical education? What's the role of science in CLT? And do you anticipate those who come out of this movement to be leaders in that field as well?
Yeah, I think it's a surprisingly high number of students coming out of these schools, homeschooled as well, are going into STEM for sure. And I think there's also a conversation happening right now within a lot of even public schools as well about what do we do with AI in terms of homework and assignments. So, we've said for years it's fine to use a calculator, and I think part of the reason why we've lost an understanding of STEM, of mathematics, as formative, right? And so, math in particular, should order someone's mind. In fact, I was often the annoying kid in middle school I remember one time Mrs. Copeland's class, I said, why do we need to learn this? And she'd say, well, it's going to be on the SAT. And I say, well, why, what's the point? And I remember she would often say something like, well, you're going to use it one day, and I remember thinking, I don't think I am. And truth be told, like I don't really use math, and I think I get by all right, and so we've told kids that you need it, to learn this because you're gonna use it, and that's this pragmatist in philosophy that has permeated so much of education. You might not ever use French, you might not ever use your Spanish, you might not ever use geometry, right? But it's actually going to shape you in a way that you ought to be shaped. There is a professor, Jeff Lehman, that I love. He talked about why do we do math, and that when a student asks a question, the best answer is because it's going to impress on your heart and your mind and your soul the beauty and order and truth in the universe, right? And it's going to condition your mind to be a receptor of truth and a discerner of truth, right? It's such a better answer than you're going to use it, right? So I think we need to bring this telos from this revival that we're seeing in the humanities and classical education into STEM as well.
Excellent. Let me ask the next question on here, and it has to do with the ACT is on a 36-point scale, the SAT is on a 1,600-point scale, and then a 2,400-point scale, and then a 1,600-point scale. What scale is yours on, and is there a way to translate how you would do relative to each other? And has that been validated through statistical analysis to say this is predictive to the same degree a score on the SAT of X would equate to the score on a CLT of Y?
Yeah, so the top score on the CLT is a 120, and we actually, this is early days, we're just kind of conceiving of this thing that doesn't exist, and we're like, we got to have a score range, and it occurred to me that the SAT was actually a 1,200-point test. You can't get below a 400, you can't get above a 1,600, and so it's really that 1,200-point score range. So the CLT concept for scoring, we dropped to 0, and said it's 120 points, and tried to be more transparent. Initially, for the first year, CLT was actually just a raw score. It's an equated score now. And so that's what we've done, and we've had a concordance chart. And you think about this dynamic of this, I find this fascinating. Somebody once actually told me that the only thing more boring than taking a standardized test is hearing me talk about a standardized test. It might have been my daughter, maybe not. But it's really fascinating because you think about the way that most companies compete against each other. Typically, you compete through both the quality of the good or the service, and then also the price point. Well, the main way the SAT and ACT have competed for market share has actually been in a different direction, right? Because whichever test over time becomes the easier test, the dumber test, is actually going to have the market advantage because then you're the easier pathway to both admissions and to scholarships. And so what we have seen is a steady progression downward. You go back and you look at the SAT from the 1970s or 80s, it was really hard, right? Today, there's not one analogy on the SAT, not one, right? The longest reading passage is 120 words, but most are more about 25 to 30 words on the SAT. And from the College Board, that's because it's more reflective of what students are reading. Well, yeah, they're reading Instagram stories and stuff, right? And so we need an alternative that is holding the line instead of, so that's one of the puzzles CLT is trying to figure out of like, all right, these two organizations have competed by diluting the standard, this race to the bottom. We're coming in to try to reset it. But for us, the nightmare scenario is like we hit the 2040 goal, we're number one, and then we realize we're just like the College Board, And so we want to make sure that we're true to mission and not compromising on the academic rigor.
Well, let it never be said that we don't use math, by the College Board don't use math, because to get 0 correct, to get a score of 400, shows you it's obviously logical. Well, that's why we need to have the math.
Yeah, and there was actually a student who got into Harvard years ago by getting every question wrong on purpose on the SAT, and then wrote about it on his essay. You'd have to know the right answer to get every single question wrong, which is a very clever way to flex your perfect 400 to get into Harvard.
Or you could leave them blank. Just saying. I guess you lose credit for leaving them guessing and getting them wrong. Anyway, One more final question from the audience, and then we'll wrap up. With a strong foundation in CLT's mission and vision, how do you envision the classical learning test evolving, if at all, in the next 5 to 10 years? What are you working on? What's the next phase, if any, or do you feel like you have your product set?
Yeah, so the main thing right now is an alternative to both International Baccalaureate program and then also the AP as well. And so you think about the influence of the College Board, and it certainly comes through the PSAT and the SAT, but probably even more so through advanced placement. And just a couple of years ago, I got a chance to talk to, it was a really cool event. It was a bunch of valedictorians from Christian schools, classical schools that had graduated over the past 20 years. And I told the CLT story, and one of them said, "It sounds like AP was more influential. Why didn't you start there?" And I said, "Because it's just too complex. I don't even know how you begin with that." And so we feel like now, after 10 years of CLT, we can launch our alternative. It's called Classical Baccalaureate. And so that's, we're trying to kind of bring in a lot of the best Christian schools, charter schools, Catholic schools around the country to say, hey, we want to create something that is reflective of what you're doing. So that's the big initiative right now. Classical Baccalaureate will have our first pilot cohort fall of 2027.
Fantastic. As you walk around campus, as we're wrapping up, you will see pretty much everywhere you look indications of the theme for this year for Pepperdine. Every year we have a theme. This year's theme is purpose. And so as we're finishing this, I want to ask you one last question before I offer some closing remarks. Our theme for this year is purpose, and our campaign theme that we're about to launch, a comprehensive campaign, is for greater purpose. How would you characterize your greater purpose? God put you here. When you're done and you're standing before Him on Judgment Day, and He says to you, "Well done, good and faithful servant," what did you do? What would you feel like? That was my purpose.
I did not know this question was coming. I
always
think
one curveball.
Yeah, I would. I'm a diehard fan of the Lord of the Rings, and I think in the CLT story, I very much identify with Frodo, who's in some ways this funny character because he doesn't really bring a whole lot to the table, other than just like a radical dependence on everyone else, But he still kind of like bears this burden, and I think that's been, my experience a lot of times over the past 10 years, of kind of, bearing this thing that, again, feels like it happened more to me than something I decided to do. So I feel like that's where we take comfort in the cross, that we can know that our, pain, suffering is not without meaning, and that we can participate in Christ's sufferings and grow closer to Him through that, And so that would be, it's a human impulse to dodge pain through whatever it may be, through distracting yourself with Instagram or through drugs or whatever people do, right? But there's something powerfully sanctifying that happens when you don't do that. And you say, I'm just going to let pain work on me. And through that, it's actually through that, I think that we really experience sanctification. So to allow myself to go through that process is my hope.
Amen. Amen. Well, for those of us on steering the leadership team, every year when the year begins, they get a coin, and the coin I carry with it every day in my pocket. It's the theme tower cross on the front with the word purpose, and I want you to have this, Jeremy.
Thank you.
As a guest. So let's all thank Jeremy.
Thank you.
What a great opportunity we've had to look into the past, look into the present, but also look into the future of both K through 12 and higher education from someone who is leading the way and is an important convener of the best and most important conversations that are happening. The goal of the President Speaker Series is to have those conversations. And so the next one that's coming is March 11th, 2 weeks from yesterday, and it's going to be at 8 p.m. in the atrium, why am I blanking? Where the well is? What do we call that? The amphitheater. The outside amphitheater, 8 p.m. with Sydney McLaughlin Lavrone. If you don't know the name, think back to the Summer Olympics, world record, gold medals, 400-meter hurdles, U.S. Olympic team on the 4x400 relay. I'll have a conversation with her about where her faith impacts her excellence in track and field. And you'll hear just an incredible story of someone who is faithful to God and gives credit to Him and glory to Him for all that He's given her. And then later in the month of March, we will have Lindsay Snyder, who is the owner and CEO of In-N-Out Burger. And yes, we will have In-N-Out burgers for everyone. So come back in 2 weeks, come back in a month and a half or so. And thank you for being here. Thank you, Jeremy. God bless you.
Thank you.
Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.